During the pandemic I met someone who became my refuge. After the distance I found a voice note and screenshots that could change everything. Do I go back to fix it or leave the silence? I still remember that first night like it happened yesterday. It was during the pandemic, everyone guarded and a little awkward, and yet we laughed until our sides hurt in a tiny room that smelled like shampoo and instant coffee. My brother introduced me to her, and somehow her sister, her mom, my friend and my brother all fit into the same ridiculous orbit for a few hours. We even made snacks out of what we found in drawers and laughed at how terrible the playlist was. That weird, bright first evening felt accidental and perfect at once. That night felt small and ordinary, but it turned into the start of something that kept me afloat longer than I expected. Over the next few weeks we texted a lot, sometimes till late, trading dumb memes and voice notes that turned into long, honest little confessions. I started visiting more. Weekends became ritualized dinners and late-night walks where we talked about everything and nothing. She was never a romantic partner, at least not for me, and probably not for her either, but the friendship had a gravity that felt safe. It was the kind of connection you notice only when it begins to crack. She had this way of turning the smallest things into a memory we both kept replaying. Sometimes she would call just to tell me about a song she heard and that made my day feel lighter. Other times she would show up with snacks and a ridiculous story about her job. I wasn't great at saying what I felt. I thought actions would carry the weight. We built a routine that felt like a mutual lifeline: visits, late texts, favors returned without asking. When life got heavy she was the first to show up, even before I asked. I remember nights when I didn't have anywhere to go and she offered me a couch without making it seem like a favor. There were jokes that only we understood and routines that felt unbreakable until they weren't. I liked to think I was giving as much as I was getting, until the silence made me question that. I missed chances to explain myself with words because I assumed my presence would be enough. Small misunderstandings slid under the door like dust, accumulating where neither of us noticed. The distance between us didn't happen overnight, it was a slow drift filled with unreturned notes and fewer calls. When we were close we were messy and loud, when we cooled off, we were careful and short. She called me her best for a while, and I believed it without asking what that meant to her. There was this detail, small at first, that later felt like a wedge driven in by someone else. I didn't answer as often as she did and sometimes I let messages sit because I didn't know how to say what I wanted. I told myself my actions showed how much I cared. I visited, I showed up, I gave time. But actions can be read in many ways, and silence is an easy place to build a story that isn't true. We grew into a pattern where visits and favors became the currency of how we measured one another. She looked out for me in ways people usually save for lovers. She checked on me when I was reckless, stayed up on nights I was anxious, drove me to places I didn't want to face alone. I repaid her in the same messy language: meals, favors, showing up when she needed an extra hand. I wasn't good at saying the simple things. I thought that the accumulation of small constancies would communicate what I couldn't say in a sentence. There was an evening I remember because it didn't feel like anything yet it mattered later. We sat in the kitchen while her mom made us tea and her sister scrolled through old photos. My brother cracked a bad joke and we all laughed too loud. At some point we cobbled together a snack from the only things in the cupboards: crackers, some cheese, syrupy jam, and declared it gourmet. The absurdity of it made us all lean into each other. Those little unnecessary moments are the ones I now replay like evidence. We were close enough to be ridiculous together. And then, slowly, the rhythm shifted. Calls became less frequent. The texts that used to carry paragraphs turned into small check-ins. She started sending longer voice notes sometimes and I didn't reply with the same length because I was convinced the next visit would make up for it. I convinced myself time would heal the small fissures that were starting to show. That conviction was a mistake, because time often amplifies what you ignore. There were moments when I felt protective of what we had, and other moments when I let convenience and inertia slide in. I assumed my consistency, showing up, helping, being practical, was louder than the words I avoided. I thought the balance of our friendship was obvious. I misread the quiet as agreement and her silence as patience. We both kept small disappointments to ourselves until they became heavy enough to be heard from a distance. Once, when I had nowhere else to go, she let me crash on her couch without making it seem like a charity case. She tucked some extra blankets around me and left a note saying she'd be back in the morning. Those gestures are the pieces I cling to when I think about what we lost. She never asked for declarations, she asked for consistency, and for a long time I thought I was supplying it. But there was a fracture I didn't see coming. It wasn't a big fight with fireworks and shouting. It was the accumulation of other people's interpretations and a single misunderstanding that took on a life of its own. There were messages she received from someone else, messages about me that I never knew existed, that changed the way she read silence. I learned later that words from other people had the power to seed doubt where trust used to be. By the time I realized it, the pattern had hardened. I remember the day she said, "Okay," when I told her I was moving 8 hours away. The answer landed like a closed door. It wasn't an angry reply, it was flat and small, and it echoed differently than any of our previous exchanges. I thought she would be sad, or at least curious, but "okay" felt like the end of a chapter rather than a comma. It hurt more than I expected to be met with a single syllable where I hoped for conversation. After that message I kept telling myself I'd reach out later, when the timing felt less raw. I let the day-to-day of moving and settling silence the urge to ask. Months went by and silence became its own explanation for why we drifted. I told myself distance would mean nothing if we were both careful to keep the threads, but threads fray without attention. When I finally unpacked the last boxes in the place I rented, I found a folder I didn't expect. It was tucked between old papers and had screenshots and, inside, a note that said there was a voice message saved in our chat that I hadn't opened. I didn't play it then. For a long time I couldn't. The idea of hearing her voice saying something that might explain months of absence felt terrifying and irresistible at once. "You should have told me," she said, voice low and precise. "I thought you walked away on purpose," I said, trying to make sense of it. "I never knew how to tell you I was scared of asking for more," she added. "Maybe I expected you to notice, to act without a script," I said. Silence became a story in the space between us, she answered. "We both waited for something the other didn't give," I admitted. "So what now? Do we try to fix what we let break?" she asked. For a while after finding that folder I carried the weight of that unopened voice note around like a secret. I took it with me when I moved, then left it in a drawer because I wasn't ready. I told myself that when I was ready to face whatever it said, I would play it, but the truth is I was afraid of how simple explanations can complicate everything. I worried that a sentence I hadn't heard yet would rewrite months of memory and guilt. There are so many small stitches in this story, the late-night calls, the shared meals, the favors that felt like proof. And there are so many tiny actions I didn't take, texts that sat unanswered, small admissions I couldn't form, and the awkward arrogance of assuming presence would speak as loudly as words. I see now how assumptions are brittle things and how the absence of an explanation becomes its own explanation to the person waiting. Every now and then I scroll through old messages and land on the last real conversation we had that felt warm. It ends with a joke about some small thing and a line about catching up soon. That line feels naive now, like a promise made in another language. When I left and received that "okay" in reply, I convinced myself we would find a way back. But the months that followed were small and dry, brief replies, no visits, and a distance that felt increasingly like habit rather than circumstance. I keep thinking about the practical moments where she showed up for me when I was messy and broken. She drove me across town when I had to find a place to stay at the last minute and let me crash in her room after a 12-hour shift without making it an ordeal. Those things are heavy in my memory because they were given freely. They sit beside my regret for not returning the same emotional clarity. I thought I was returning it in action, but actions can be misread or unseen. Now, months after moving states, I find myself facing the question I've been avoiding. Do I press play on the voice note and let whatever is on it change my narrative, or do I keep holding the version of us that I want to remember? Part of me hopes the recording will be some minor misunderstanding that can be cleared with an apology. Another part is terrified that it will point to a betrayal or a misstep I never knew I made. Both possibilities are scary in different ways. I imagine driving back for a weekend, rehearsing how to say the things I never could. I imagine a conversation where we sit across from each other, honest and slow, and I explain my clumsy way of caring while she explains the fracture she felt. I imagine an outcome where we try again with clearer boundaries and more explicit words, and I imagine another where we close the book with a hard conversation and keep the good memories without the closeness. None of those futures feel simple. I post this because the not knowing has become unbearable in its own way. Carrying a folder of screenshots and an unheard voice message feels like holding a letter that will either free me or tie me to a decision I can't undo. If I play it alone, I might get answers but also lose the opportunity to hear them directly from her. If I wait and see her, I might get the conversation framed by both of us in real time, but I might also let assumptions fill the space again. There are moments I replay where I could have been clearer, where I could have said, "I don't know how to respond, but I care," and moments where I let pride or fear keep me quiet. The truth is I never learned how to translate my care into the words she needed. I gave the practical, the visible, and expected that to be enough. It wasn't always. I don't know what I want from you all, advice, judgment, or just to unburden a story I've kept tidy in my head, but if you know the weight of an unanswered voice note and the way a single "okay" can land, you know why this feels urgent to me now. I don't want to dramatize what might be explainable, and I don't want to minimize what might be permanent. I only know that silence has stretched long enough and that maybe it's time to decide whether to play the recording or let it be a question I carry when I see her next. When I sleep I dream of simpler exchanges, a lunch where we laugh about nothing, a walk where we notice the same stupid dog, a message where one of us admits a fear and the other answers with reassurance. Those small things are what I hope we can get back if the story allows. But I also prepare for the possibility that the voice note will be a turning point and that whatever it contains will force more than a conversation, it will force a conclusion. So here I am, writing it out in the kind of messy honesty I usually avoid. I moved 8 hours away, I found that folder, I haven't played the message yet, and I'm thinking about going back for a weekend to face it. The question that keeps turning in my head is simple and terrible. Do I press play now and listen alone, or do I wait until I can meet her and hear the story together? To explain myself with words because I assumed my presence would be enough. Small misunderstandings slid under the door like dust, accumulating where neither of us noticed. The distance between us didn't happen overnight, it was a slow drift filled. About 6 months after I moved 8 hours away, I found a folder in the place I rented that held screenshots and a voice note saved in our WhatsApp chat that I had never played. I hadn't listened because I was afraid. That, okay, she sent when I said I was leaving kept echoing, and the not knowing had started to weigh on me. Now I decide to press play. I open the chat and tap the voice note. Her voice fills the room and it's immediate, not the playful tone I remember, but softer, a little broken. She breathes at the start, the kind of small intake people make when about to say something that matters. Hearing that breath makes everything feel sharper. She begins with small details, a cafe we used to joke about, a coworker with bad sweaters, then the note tightens. She talks about an argument we had weeks before, an argument I thought was over. She says she waited for me to ask what was wrong but I didn't, and that feeling of being left became the lens through which she read my later silences. When she says abandoned, I feel it like a physical thing. Her voice doesn't shout, she just pronounces the word carefully, like testing its edges. The recording captures ordinary background noise, a kettle, footsteps, and that domestic sound makes her words hit harder. There's a pause and then she mentions a screenshot a friend sent her, something she read that changed how she saw me. I tense because I never heard about that screenshot. She describes trying to ask me about it and feeling my answers were small and insufficient. As she explains, I start to see how my absences could have been read as indifference. Then the note cuts right before a line that feels crucial. The recording ends at an awkward place, and for a moment I feel cheated and relieved together. Was something left out on purpose, or is it just an old file that stops where it stops? That silence feels enormous. After the break she continues, quieter. She says she wanted to say this in person but distance made it harder. She explains that small omissions compounded until hope ran thin. She asks whether I ever noticed how those omissions felt to her. The question lands differently than any accusation I remember, it is careful and open. I sink into a chair. My mind flicks through memories, the nights she drove me home, the couch she offered me when I had nowhere else, the times I assumed presence would be proof. Hearing her voice describe how those actions contrasted with my later silences makes me see the mismatch between my intent and her experience. I scroll the chat looking for clues, timestamps, photos, partial screenshots. There are thumbnails of a cafe receipt and a blurred image. I don't open everything because I know context matters. Reading pieces without her there to explain them would be dangerous, it would let me build a story out of fragments. The urge to reply immediately with a long apology is strong. I draft messages and erase them. I imagine forwarding the audio to a friend for a second opinion, but quickly reject that. This felt like something between the two of us. The idea of someone else interpreting her tone before I can is unbearable. Later, I send a short, careful message. I found the voice note and I listened. Can we talk in person? I almost add an apology but stop. I want the first real exchange to be face-to-face if she is willing. I suggest a day. Then I wait. Her reply comes hours later, cautious, not a yes. She says she was scared to send the recording and that maybe talking in person is better. She can't commit to the suggested day, but she asks to plan. It's not closure, but it opens a door. That night I replay parts of the note in my head. The absence of the one crucial line gnaws at me. What if that missing sentence is something I can't fix in a weekend? What if it's a misunderstanding I can clarify? The unknown sits heavy, but deciding to ask to meet feels like moving from inertia to action. I book a ticket for a weekend trip. It feels like a necessary crossing. Part of me is afraid I'll find out something irreversible, another part is relieved to be doing something concrete. On the train I think about how fragile communication can be, how much we assume, and how easily small omissions become narratives. I rehearse what I might say when I see her. I am sorry I didn't say the right things. I want to hear what you needed. It feels awkward to script emotion, but after months of silence I need a way to show I'm serious. I promise myself to listen without interrupting and to avoid defensive explanations that turn into excuses. Arriving in the city, my stomach is a tight knot. I text to confirm a time. We agree to meet at a cafe near the old places we used to joke about. The cafe table is small and ordinary, the same kind of place where our early conversations felt effortless. When she walks in I notice everything, how she holds her bag, the way she scans the room, the slight pause before she sits. We say hello like people who have history. The small physicality of the moment makes months of messages feel like a different language. We start awkwardly, filling space with things that don't matter, and then she takes a breath and says she was scared. She explains the screenshot she received and how it made her question whether I cared when she needed more clarity. I listen and try not to interject too soon. She doesn't accuse in a dramatic way, she explains how the accumulation of small silences grew into a story of its own. I tell her about the things I couldn't say, how I thought actions would show up as proof, how I avoided words because I didn't know how to name my feelings without making them sound excessive. I tell her I misread her patience as agreement. I avoid making it about blame and try to keep it on what I did and what I didn't do. At one point she looks down and a shadow passes across her face. She admits that the screenshot made her feel betrayed in a way that had little to do with whatever the screenshot contained and more to do with a fear that I would choose comfort over her. The nuance of that hits me harder than I expected. It wasn't a single event, it was the pattern she had been feeling. We talk for hours, less in theatrical confessions and more in small, sometimes clumsy explanations. There are pauses. Sometimes we laugh at memory, and at others we look at our cups, each of us recalibrating what we've thought for too long. I apologize for the things I left unsaid and I ask questions I should have asked before. She answers honestly. Sometimes it hurts, and sometimes it feels like relief to say real things out loud. By the end of the day we don't have everything solved, and some silence still sits between us. But we make a plan, clearer check-ins, a promise to call instead of letting messages pile up, and a boundary about involving others in conversations that should remain private. We agree that rebuilding trust will take time and small, consistent acts. On the train back I feel battered and oddly light. The voice note I once feared is no longer a sealed box, hearing her in person added context I couldn't have had alone. The missing line in the recording still hangs in my memory, but it matters less because I heard the explanation and saw her eyes when she said it. The decision to listen alone and the decision to go meet were both necessary in different ways, but neither replaced the other. I learned that silence can be read as permission and that absence can be a story if not addressed. I also learned that intention is fragile, what you mean is often not what gets received. The weekend didn't erase everything, but it changed the direction of what we could try to build. Now I carry a new kind of responsibility, to turn the things I did into language she can understand, and to keep showing up in ways she recognizes as care. I won't pretend it's easy. It will be small and often imperfect. But for the first time in many months, I feel like I'm moving forward with eyes open. I make practical preparations before I go back, booking travel, picking a neutral cafe, asking my brother for a favor that guarantees I will follow through. On the train I watch landscapes and practice listening without planning a defense. At the cafe, seeing her in person makes the difference. She tells me the screenshot lodged as a possibility and multiplied. I explain moments I took for granted. We name small habits to change, a call after a rough day, a short clarifying question instead of letting messages pile, and a rule to avoid bringing others into private matters. We test this new rhythm after we part. Sometimes we get it right. Sometimes we slip and correct course. Rebuilding trust turns out to be about repeated small truths more than grand gestures. I still keep the folder in a drawer, and I haven't mined every screenshot because some things are better handled face-to-face. The recording started as a terrifying secret and ended up being the spark that pushed us toward an honest conversation. I don't know where this will lead in 6 months. There are no guarantees. But I know that not acting felt worse than being imperfect in action. The choice to listen to that note and then to show up was messy and necessary, and it changed how I approach not only this friendship but how I try to be present with other people as well. About 6 months after moving 8 hours away I finally listened to the voice note I had saved and then flew back for a weekend to talk in person. We met at the small cafe we used to joke about. She explained how a screenshot someone sent her made her feel abandoned, and I explained how I leaned on actions instead of words. We agreed to try again with clearer boundaries and small habits to rebuild trust. Now, this is the follow-up weeks later, the part where consequences land and we decide what to keep and what to change. The day after that first weekend we didn't text much. It felt strange to have resolved a thing in person and then return to the slow hum of regular life. I told myself that the new agreement, calls instead of silent threads, and a rule about not dragging third parties into private matters, would hold because we both looked at each other and meant it. Reality, as it usually does, needed time to test our words. In the following days we tried to leave small reminders of our promises. I set a short alarm after lunchtime that I called check-in, so I would not let days slip without a voice. It was dumbly practical, but it worked. She began sending little voice notes about trivial things, an odd meeting at work, a coffee she loved that week, and I answered with something real instead of a curt emoji. The difference was subtle but cumulative. Words that before would have been left to hang were now tethered quickly enough that they couldn't grow into stories. There were awkward moments. Once I called after a rough meeting, and instead of saying what I felt I started explaining, and she interrupted me with, "Stop, just tell me what happened." Her bluntness was a gift because it forced me to drop the scripts I used to hide behind. I said, "I felt stupid," and she said, "Okay, I hear that." It was not cinematic, it was small and efficient, and it moved us forward. Even so, trust is a slow thing. There were nights when my brain rehearsed old habits, silence, avoidance, especially when I thought an apology should be private and clean, not messy and repeated. Rebuilding required me to be awkward publicly, to answer with the kind of bluntness I'd avoided before. It required me sending a 3-line check-in instead of pretending a weekend visit was a permanent fix. She also had days when she backed away. Sometimes fear returned when I forgot to call or when my reply came a few hours late. I could feel it in the way her voice tightened when she asked an apparently small question. In those moments I did what I promised, I called instead of typing. Sometimes the call was short and felt clumsy, but it was better than letting tone drift into assumption. Over time the tightened voice softened a little more quickly than it used to. We also established a boundary about involving friends. She told me how a screenshot and a friend's comment had amplified her doubts. We agreed to handle confusion directly between us and to ask clarifying questions before letting others color the story. It was a practical rule, but one that mattered. It prevented gossip from becoming a substitute for conversation. The practicalities of this new arrangement required humility. I had to admit when I was careless. She had to admit when she let other people's words become louder than my actions. There were points when either of us would say something like, "That sounded like you were accusing me," and the next word would be, "Sorry," because the default had shifted from defense to repair. Saying sorry became less about admitting a catastrophic failure and more about acknowledging the friction of being human together. The small rituals we invented were not groundbreaking: a 5-minute call after a long day, a quick voice note if one of us was going to be silent for a while, a check-in before assuming anything. They were a scaffolding, not an instant fix. But scaffolds are the job site of trust, and work must be done daily. A month in we hit our first test. She received a message from someone at work that referenced me in a way that sounded off. My first impulse was to be smug and let her find the truth as if vindication were a prize. Instead I answered the message with transparency: "Tell me what you saw and let's talk it through." We spoke for 30 minutes and dissected it without judgment. The difference from before was that we addressed the thing immediately rather than leaning on silence and letting a narrative form in the spaces between. Sometimes I wasn't as quick as I thought I'd be. I worried that my failures would avalanche into the same old feeling she'd had, that a late reply would be proof that I preferred convenience. She pointed out once, tender and sharp, that inconsistency hurts more than occasional absence. Consistency, she said, is not frequency alone but predictability in regard to the promises you make. That line stuck with me. Doing what I said I'd do mattered more than grand declarations. We had to relearn the etiquette of asking for reassurance. I used to think asking for it would make me weak or needy. She used to think not getting it was abandonment. We both redefined what asking meant: an invitation to connect instead of a demand. When I texted, "Can we talk later?" feeling off, it was not dramatic, it became a reliable way to avoid the gulf we used to drift into. There were also moments of joy that reminded us why we wanted to keep this. We returned to dumb rituals, same small cafe, same ridiculous snack concoctions, the laugh at a joke only we found funny. Those moments were not magical in a cinematic way, they were everyday and therefore valuable. They were the ordinary evidence that the relationship could be a daily practice instead of a brittle memory. At some point the voice note I'd once feared stopped filling my chest with dread and instead became an artifact of a moment that helped start a conversation. The missing line in the recording no longer felt like a trap. Hearing her explain the context in person had peeled away the jagged edges of my imagination. It didn't erase the hurt, but it reframed it. One of the hardest parts was admitting that some things needed an external shape to be safe. We agreed on a simple practice: when one of us received troubling information about the other from a third party, we would pause before reacting publicly and check directly with the person involved. We built a small script for those moments. "I heard X, does that mean Y?" It is awkward, but it's reduced the number of stories spun from missing facts. Months passed and we tried to be less dramatic about small slights. The energy required for this was real. It meant saying, "I don't know," instead of pretending a canned answer. It meant asking, "Did I mess up?" and actually listening. It meant begging for patience sometimes, and asking permission to try again. There were conversations where I cried in public and she held my hand. There were conversations where she let her guard down and admitted she had been unfair to herself by trusting gossip. Those moments carried weight because they were honest rather than performative. They proved that vulnerability was a muscle we were both willing to train. We also had to negotiate boundaries because rebuilding doesn't mean erasing past habits that caused pain. We decided on a simple framework: transparency without surveillance. We would share worrying messages but not demand access to each other's phones. We would ask for clarifications and allow for privacy. It felt like learning to dance with respect for the other's space while staying within reach. Not everything healed. There are still corridors in our conversations that feel delicate. Sometimes we avoid topics because they still sting. But avoiding has become a conscious choice rather than an unconscious drift. When avoidance happens now, we flag it: "We are not talking about X, can we schedule a time to do that?" And that honesty often dissolves the worst of the tension. The biggest lesson I've carried is about language. I used to believe my actions would translate clearly into meaning. They did not. People interpret silence in the ways fear tells them to. If someone says they felt abandoned because you were quiet, accepting that as a truth about their experience, without immediately defending your intention, is an act of respect that can open the door to repair. I learned, too, that you don't need to know the perfect thing to say. Often the most useful phrases were simple: "I messed up, I didn't mean to hurt you, help me understand what you needed." Those small truths made room for the longer conversations we both needed. Practically, we continued to test the framework. We scheduled a monthly check-in where we asked each other what had gone well and what had felt off. That meeting was short and rarely dramatic. Its value was in preventing accumulation. It was bureaucratic in a way that felt right. The best relationships I know have a boring administrative side that keeps emotions from becoming legal cases. By the time 3 months had passed, our interactions felt more like a slow repair than a honeymoon. There were still nights I worried about losing what we rebuilt, but the default had shifted from fear to maintenance. When I thought about the alternative, never asking and letting silence calcify, I'm glad I chose the annoying, imperfect work of showing up. We also learned to celebrate small wins. A week where neither of us let a worrying silence grow was celebrated with a dumb late-night order and a text thread that meandered with memes. Those small celebrations were a reminder that normalcy was possible and that normalcy could be chosen. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd pressed play sooner or if I'd driven back sooner. Regret sits beside gratitude. Regret for the months I didn't speak and gratitude that I eventually chose to risk an awkward conversation rather than let the story harden. The decision to listen and then to show up was not a clean arc, but it was the right motion. In the end, we made a pact that feels simple and challenging in equal measure: to treat silence as a question, not a verdict. When one of us goes quiet, the other asks, not assumes. When hurt arrives, we respond with curiosity instead of accusation. It is not a promise of perfection. It is a promise of process. I still keep the folder in a drawer. Sometimes I take it out and look at the screenshots and the recording file name. I don't play the note anymore. I don't need to. It helped start a necessary conversation, but the conversation itself is the living thing I tend now. If you asked me what changed most, I'd say 2 things. First, I learned that consistency is louder than grand gestures. Showing up in predictable ways rewired how my presence was read. Second, I learned the humility of naming shortcomings before they calcify into other people's stories about you. Saying, "I didn't know," and then asking, "Can you tell me?" is a small repair that prevents a lot of damage. There are days I still feel clumsy, and moments when old instincts to withdraw resurface. But the difference now is I notice them sooner. I call. I say the small thing. I apologize when I can. Sometimes it's enough. Sometimes it's not. The point is we are trying, and trying changes the math. When I think about the future of this friendship, I don't imagine a fairy tale comeback. I imagine something less glamorous: slow rebuilding, the occasional setback, and steady choices to stay present. I imagine us having fewer dramatic gaps and more small, steady threads of contact. I imagine a friendship where both of us can be messy and wrong and still decide to keep showing up. If you are reading this and you are carrying an unheard message or an unopened voice note, consider whether the thing you fear might be an opportunity to start a real conversation. It may not be pretty. It may force you to face uncomfortable things and to be imperfect in public. But silence compounds, conversation can unstick it. For me, pressing play was the first breath. Meeting her in that small cafe was a follow-through that made words mean something. The work after that was the long, unsexy part that required repetition. I am not finished, I will likely make mistakes again. But I also now have a scaffold and a vocabulary and a partner who has agreed to try with me. That feels like enough for today. I don't know exactly where we'll be in a year. Maybe we'll have settled into a friendship that looks ordinary and good, or maybe we'll find we are better as people who keep the warm memory without the constant presence. Both outcomes feel preferable to letting uncertainty calcify into permanent absence. Either way, the work we did has taught me to be less arrogant about how my actions are read and to be more generous with the small words that prevent silence from telling the wrong story. So I keep the little rituals. I keep calling. I keep apologizing. I keep listening. And sometimes, when I get nervous, I reread a message she once sent where she said, simply, "I missed you." It reminds me that we were worth the trouble. If you have a similar story, don't let fear harden the truth into something harder to fix. Ask the question, press play, go back when you need to. The cost of silence is usually higher than the risk of speaking. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. Thanks for your attention.